What if the earliest rulers on Earth never believed they were creating power, only receiving it? Not discovering authority for the first time, but stepping into a position that already existed, measured, recorded, and waiting. When you look at southern Mesopotamia from above, you see a land shaped by water, a flat plain where rivers wrote the borders of life. Channels cut through soil like careful handwriting. Fields appear where there should be dust. Cities rise where there should be marsh. This was a place where survival depended on order, on someone deciding where the water would go, who would maintain the banks, who would measure the grain, who would settle disputes when land boundaries shifted with every season. And perhaps that is why the oldest records we have from this region do not begin with heroic conquest. They begin with lists. Not poems, not legends, lists. Names, cities, and years pressed into clay with the same sober precision used for barley rations and temple inventory. The kind of writing created by a society that believed reality could be managed if it could be recorded. In the 19th century, when European excavators began pulling Mesopotamian tablets from collapsed libraries, they expected to find myth. They expected primitive stories, the distant preface to real history. Instead, they found something that read like administration, a document that didn't explain how power was invented, only how it moved, only how it transferred, only how it resumed. It would eventually become known as the Sumerian King List, and the way it opens is still capable of bending the mind into silence, because it does not say a king arose. It does not say a city conquered. It does not say humans established rule. It says something colder, simpler, and far more destabilizing. Kingship descended. Not metaphorically, not poetically, descended, as if the office of rulership existed before the people who held it, as if the throne was not built by human hands, but delivered. And then it names the first city, Eridu. Not the largest, not the most famous in later empires, but the first seat of this descending authority. Then a name follows, Ululim, and next to that name, a number. A number so large that it doesn't sit comfortably inside any modern historical timeline. Tens of thousands of years. Then the next king and another immense number. Then another and another. The most unsettling detail is not the scale of the reigns, it is the tone. The text doesn't react to those numbers. It doesn't explain them away. It doesn't surround them with miracles. It records them in the same flat accounting language used for grain shipments, as if the scribe was copying from an archive he considered normal, even if the world that archive described no longer existed. Modern scholarship has tried to soften this: symbolic inflation, dynastic totals, mythic ages, numerological systems. And some of those explanations may be partially true, but they do not erase what the tablet is doing. It is asserting without hesitation that rulership was not born on Earth, it arrived. And it operated under conditions that later humanity could not sustain, because the list draws a line, a single sentence that divides all time into before and after. The flood swept over. No drama, no poetic storm, no moral sermon, just a dividing line, like a bureaucrat stamping a file closed. Everything before it belongs to one regime, everything after it belongs to another. And in that quiet division is where the story begins to feel less like myth and more like memory. Because when archaeologists excavated the earliest cities named in these lists, Eridu, Shuruppak, Kish, Uruk, they found something physical, not a myth, not a symbol, a layer. Clean silt, flood sediment, a sterile band interrupting human debris. In multiple sites across southern Mesopotamia, there is evidence of major inundation around the early 3rd millennium BCE, around the same period ancient writers used as a hinge in their narratives. This does not prove the global flood of later traditions, but it does prove something more important for this story. The scribes were not inventing catastrophe as a literary convenience. They were preserving a remembered rupture, a moment when the structure of the world changed. And what happens after that line is equally strange, because the list continues. Kingship returns. Not invented again, not rebuilt from scratch, returns, as if the office had been paused, then reissued. But now the reins shrink. The numbers descend rapidly toward human lifetimes. Years that sound like human lifetimes begin to appear, a slow tightening of reality, like a world re-entering its normal rules. And this shift, pre-flood vastness, post-flood contraction, creates a kind of pressure in the mind, because it suggests a possibility the scribes themselves never explicitly argue but quietly assume, that the earliest civilized world was not humanity's first attempt, that the first cities were not primitive experiments, that what we call the beginning may have been to them restoration. And once you notice that pattern, it begins to appear everywhere. Take the earliest urban explosion in Mesopotamia, Uruk. Uruk is the kind of site archaeologists expected to find at the end of development, not at the start. Yet it arrives in the record with monumental architecture, organized bureaucracy, mass-produced pottery, and a writing system capable of abstract accounting. Not crude scratches struggling toward language, a mature script. Not tiny villages slowly learning to coordinate, a city that behaves like it has already solved the problem of civilization. Walls, temples, specialized labor, central planning, a system. And what is more disturbing, the culture seems less interested in bragging about invention than it is in proving continuity. In inscriptions and temple texts, rulers repeatedly describe their projects not as foundations, but restorations. Not "I built," but "I rebuilt." Not "I created," but "I returned it to what it was." Language like that implies a model, a blueprint, an older reference point. Sometimes the phrase appears with startling clarity, the restoration of what was before. Before what? Before the flood, the lists suggest. Before the loss. Before the world tightened into human scale. Imagine a scribe in that environment. Not a storyteller around a fire, a trained administrator. Someone who spends his days measuring grain, listing workers, recording disputes, copying legal formulas. This kind of person is not rewarded for imagination, he is rewarded for accuracy. So when that scribe copies a document saying kingship descended from heaven, he is not presenting a metaphor, he is presenting a constitutional fact in the worldview of his society, an origin statement for authority. And the beings associated with that origin, Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, do not always appear in early texts as distant mystical creators. They appear as assigners, measurers, regulators of calendars, arbiters of boundaries, controllers of water. The tone can feel less like devotion and more like governance, a world run by administrators of order. And then their presence recedes, not slain, not defeated, absent. And humanity continues, keeping the machinery running, copying formulas, maintaining canals, rebuilding temples on the same alignments, like caretakers of a system they did not design. This is where the story becomes both historical and unsettling, because the record suggests not that early people believed they invented civilization, but that they believed they inherited it, inherited the throne, inherited the city plan, inherited the measuring systems, inherited the way time is divided. And if that sounds exaggerated, consider how deeply one Mesopotamian choice still governs your life. Base 60. Hours, minutes, seconds. A circle broken into 360 degrees. A system that appears in early mathematical tablets already functional, already standardized, not presented as a new discovery, presented as a tool, as if it had always been there, as if the world was already measured before humanity took over the measuring. That feeling of stepping into a world already structured runs beneath the entire Mesopotamian archive, thousands of tablets baked and stored like a civilization terrified of forgetting. And that is perhaps the most revealing emotional signature of all. They wrote as preservers, not as pioneers. They wrote like people standing in the aftermath of something larger, copying what they could still understand, maintaining what they could still enforce, afraid that if they stopped recording, the thread would snap entirely. And this is why the list matters.
not because it proves impossible reigns, not because it forces us to accept tens of thousands of years literally, but because it preserves a worldview, that authority did not originate in human ambition, it descended, it was placed, it was allocated. And then the allocation changed. A floodline, a rupture, a withdrawal, a scaling down of the world from cosmic administration to human governance. And now, with that frame in mind, we can move deeper. Because once you accept that Mesopotamian civilization viewed itself as an inheritor, a restorer, a keeper of older templates, then the next question becomes unavoidable. If kingship was something that could descend and redescend, then what exactly were the ones who held it before humans did? And why did the ancient world record them the way it recorded barley? With numbers,
The story becomes stranger the moment you treat the flood not as a symbol, but as a boundary. Because in the Mesopotamian record, the flood is not described like a moral lesson. It isn't framed as a cleansing. It isn't framed as a punishment. It's framed like a reset in administration, a line in a ledger, a single sentence that closes one era and opens another. And what makes that line difficult to dismiss is that the ground itself seems to remember something similar. Across the cities of the southern plain, Kish, Shuruppak, archaeologists have uncovered layers of clean sediment interrupting human occupation. Not the dark mixed debris of normal habitation, not the gradual shifts you'd expect from slow change. A pale, sterile band, silt laid down by water. A layer that separates one world from the next. In some sites it's thin, in others it's thick. The Mesopotamian plain is wide, and floods do not strike every place equally. Rivers spill differently depending on channels, banks, and timing, but the pattern is there often enough that even cautious scholars admit what the ancient tablets already insisted. A major inundation happened, a catastrophe large enough to be remembered as a dividing line. And that is where the hum begins, the quiet implication beneath the facts. Because if the flood was real in some form, then the king list's structure becomes more than literary. It becomes a model of historical memory. Before the flood, enormous rains, cosmic scale, a sense of governance that feels older than humanity. After the flood, shrinking lifespans, recognizably human dynasties, political conflict, wars, taxes, and the kind of messy reality we think of as history. Not only do the numbers change, the atmosphere changes. The world becomes heavier, more limited, more mortal. The king list does not tell you what the flood destroyed, but it implies what the flood ended. And to understand why, you have to step into the mind of the people who rebuilt afterward. Imagine what it means to rebuild a city on a plain that has been drowned. Not merely repairing damage, but digging down to find where the old foundations were. Finding the lines, the alignments, the sacred geometry. Then placing your new bricks exactly where the old bricks stood. Not because that is the easiest way, because it is the correct way. Because the city's shape is not negotiable. In Mesopotamia, temples were not moved casually. Sacred districts were not placed wherever a king felt inspired. Cities were written into space through planning, surveying, and ritual. Orientation mattered. Placement mattered. The position of an altar in relation to the cardinal points mattered. And in multiple sites, builders after the flood did not invent new plans, they restored old ones. This is not a romantic interpretation, it's visible in the ground. New walls following old lines, new platforms rising on old mounds, new shrines built over older ruins with the same internal layout. The phrase restoration appears in inscriptions because restoration was what these people believed they were doing. The question is, restoration of what? If you assume civilization develops slowly, then post-flood Mesopotamia should look like a beginner stage, simple houses, crude organization, trial and error technology. But many of the first post-flood centuries look like continuity. The same fundamental tools of order return. Irrigation planning, standardized measurement, temple-based administration, and increasingly, the rapid spread of writing. Not the slow birth of civilization, the resumption of it. That is what the scribes said, and the ground quietly agrees. Now consider something even more unsettling. The flood line does not only divide the king list, it divides the way knowledge is described. After the flood, the texts begin to sound like people maintaining a machine they did not design. They speak constantly of old writings, of ancient instructions, of the proper way, defined not by experimentation, but by precedent. A king does not justify a temple by saying it will be better. He justifies it by saying it will be faithful.
A scribe does not boast about creativity, he boasts about correct copying. And the reason is simple. If you believe you inherited a system, your highest virtue is preservation. This is why the Mesopotamian obsession with archives matters. They wrote on clay not because clay was beautiful, but because clay could survive. When baked, it became stone-like. It resisted fire. It resisted time. It could be buried and retrieved. It could outlive empires. The people who built these libraries understood impermanence. They understood that memory dies. So they pressed memory into earth. Thousands upon thousands of tablets, contracts, catalogs, astronomical observations, legal codes, medicinal recipes. Myths, yes, but also instructions, inventories, and calculations. And here is the quiet fact modern people rarely feel in their bones. A culture does not preserve that obsessively unless it fears loss. And fear of loss is what follows catastrophe. The floodline is not merely an event, it is a psychological scar. It is a reminder that civilization can be erased, that infrastructure can vanish, that the order you rely on is fragile. So you build your world on continuity. You rebuild the temple on the same line. You carve the canal where it was carved before. You maintain the calendar. You maintain the system of weights. You maintain the law. And when you can't remember why something is done, you do it anyway, because the old writings say so. That brings us to a subtle but crucial shift. In later monotheistic traditions, catastrophe is moralized. It becomes a story of sin and punishment followed by salvation. But in many early Mesopotamian flood accounts, the catastrophe has an oddly administrative tone. The divine beings debate policy. They address overpopulation. They respond to noise. They negotiate the future. The language can feel like governance rather than wrath. And whatever you believe about gods, this tone tells you how the scribes conceptualized the world, not as a mythic drama, but as a structured system managed by authority. Before the flood, that authority appears close to earth. After the flood, it recedes. The flood becomes the moment when governance changes from direct oversight to distance, when the office remains, but the administrators withdraw. And the king list marks this shift with mathematical discipline, because the numbers don't merely drop from impossible to human instantly. They descend, gradually, like a dial being turned down over generations. Post-flood reigns begin still unusually long, hundreds of years, then shrink to decades. That's not random. It reads like a memory of diminishing conditions, as if something that once extended life no longer saturates the world, as if proximity to the pre-flood era mattered, as if whatever made the first rains possible decayed after the rupture. You do not have to take this literally to understand the structure. The structure itself is the message. There was an old order, then there was a break, then there was a diminished restoration. And once you see that model, you begin to notice how deeply it is embedded in Mesopotamian self-understanding. For example, even the way they spoke about temples. At sites like Eridu, archaeologists discovered layer after layer of temple foundations, one built on top of another. Not random rebuilding, not shifting styles, a repeated plan over and over. A central shrine, an altar, a consistent orientation. Across centuries, the geometry remains faithful. Each new temple is larger, yes, but it is not a new design. It is the same design, amplified. That pattern suggests something more than cultural conservatism. It suggests that the first plan was treated as sacred, as original, as authoritative, and that all later builders saw themselves as inheritors of that plan, not inventors. So, what could make a plan sacred for 3,000 years? Either the plan was attached to a powerful theology, or the plan came from an authority the builders believed was older and wiser than themselves. Which brings you back again to that opening phrase, kingship descended, not created, lowered, placed. There's also a practical dimension to this.
Irrigation is unforgiving. If you miscalculate, fields become salt flats, crops fail, cities collapse, authority ends. Mesopotamia was a civilization built on engineering. Water control is not a poetic achievement, it is a mathematical one. So you can imagine why the people who managed water would also become obsessed with measurement, with record keeping, with continuity. And when you look at their systems, weights, fractions, base 60, you see something that feels mature very early. Base 60 is not the easiest system to invent casually. It is elegant and divisibility rich, perfect for fractions and timekeeping. It is the kind of system you get from long-term practical refinement, or from inheritance. Because if the system was already there, already useful, then the first scribes wouldn't need to justify it.
There is a moment in the archaeological record where expectation collapses. A moment when the story we assume should unfold gradually simply doesn't. Because when researchers finally uncovered the earliest levels of Uruk, they did not find hesitation. They did not find clumsy beginnings. They did not find a civilization learning how to be civilized. They found a system already running. Uruk appears around the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, not as a village experimenting with complexity, but as a city that already knows what a city is supposed to be. Defensive walls stretch for kilometers, requiring coordinated labor, standardized brick production, and centralized authority. These are not the byproducts of improvisation, they are the outcomes of planning. Inside the walls, districts are already specialized. Residential quarters follow patterns, craft areas cluster, temple complexes dominate the urban core, elevated on platforms that required immense effort to construct. And perhaps most unsettling of all, writing is already there. Not scratches, not tentative symbols, but a fully operational system capable of abstraction. The earliest cuneiform tablets do not record poetry or myth, they record accounting. Grain deliveries, labor assignments, inventory lists, contracts. This is what bureaucracies write when they already exist. Writing did not emerge as self-expression, it emerged as administration. And administration implies inheritance, because a system does not invent itself while it is already functioning. The earliest writing tablets show trained scribes using conventions consistently. Signs are standardized, syntax is understood, numerical systems are embedded seamlessly into text. There is no learning phase preserved, no stage where scribes struggled to express ideas, no discarded experiments. Writing appears as though it was introduced into an environment already prepared to use it. This is what scholars refer to as the Uruk expansion, but the term hides the discomfort. Expansion implies growth. What Uruk represents feels more like arrival. And this is not limited to writing. The pottery is wheel-thrown and mass-produced, uniform shapes, consistent quality, rapid output. The wheel itself, one of humanity's most transformative inventions, appears without visible developmental stages in this context. No gradual transition from sled to rolling platform, no experimentation layers. The wheel is simply there, used competently, efficiently, at scale. This alone challenges linear narratives of progress, but it is the archives that deepen the unease. Thousands of tablets were deliberately stored, cataloged, and preserved. These were not casual notes, they were institutional memory. When libraries collapse, it is often because institutions collapse with them. But Uruk's earliest levels already contain evidence of an institution that understood its own fragility. They baked tablets, they stored them, they archived, they planned for survival beyond the present. That mindset belongs to a civilization that believes something precious can be lost, and loss implies a past. Now consider the structure of knowledge in these texts. They do not argue, they do not explain, they assert. Mathematical relationships are stated, not derived. Calendrical cycles are used, not justified. Astronomical observations appear as data, not discovery. This is the tone of people maintaining a reference manual, not writing the first draft. One tablet might record the area of a field using geometric relationships that require conceptual understanding of ratios and square roots. Another tracks the distribution of rations across months using a calendar already synchronized with lunar cycles. These are not primitive tools, they are refined, and they appear together early as part of a unified system. Which brings us back to the flood line. If a catastrophe disrupted the world but did not erase all knowledge, then what emerges afterward could look exactly like Uruk. Not a beginning, a restart. But a restart guided by templates, by preserved instructions, by institutions that survived in fragmentary form. And this is exactly how the Sumerians describe themselves. They speak constantly of copying older texts, of preserving ancient instructions, of following precedents established in distant days. They rarely speak of innovation as a virtue. Instead, correctness is the highest ideal. Correct copying, correct alignment, correct ritual, correct measurement, correct timing. The scribal schools train students not to invent, but to replicate faithfully. Errors were sins. Alterations were dangerous, because if knowledge is inherited, corruption is the enemy. This worldview explains something else that often puzzles modern readers: why so many Mesopotamian texts feel repetitive. Why hymns, laws, rituals, and formulas repeat across centuries with minimal change. From our perspective, this looks like stagnation. From theirs, it looks like stewardship. They were guarding something. And when you believe knowledge is ancient and fragile, repetition becomes an act of reverence. This also explains why Mesopotamian culture invested so heavily in education. Scribal training was long, rigorous, and hierarchical. Students copied tablets line by line, sign by sign, until muscle memory replaced interpretation. They learned lists before stories, signs before meaning, structure before expression. This is how you train archivists, not artists. And the reason becomes clear when you examine how they thought about the past. The past was not primitive. The past was authoritative. The earliest age was the age of full order. What came later was decline, adaptation, and partial recovery. This is the inverse of modern historical thinking. For us, the future is progress. For them, the past was perfection. And that belief permeates everything. Take architecture. The earliest monumental temples are not crude. They are proportioned, aligned, symbolically layered. Ziggurats do not evolve from small mounds. They appear with a coherent cosmological logic, stepped platforms rising toward the sky, each level associated with celestial order, each orientation fixed. These structures do not prioritize utility, they prioritize correspondence, heaven mirrored on earth, order made visible. And every later ziggurat follows a same pattern, not because later builders lacked imagination, but because deviation was unacceptable. The structure was not theirs to change. It belonged to the original order. Now pause and ask a dangerous question. If a civilization believes its most important systems were inherited from a prior age, what happens when that belief is correct? Not in a literal sense, but in a functional one. Imagine a world where an earlier culture, whether human or not, had already solved key problems: water management, timekeeping, surveying, law. Then catastrophe erased that culture's infrastructure, but not all its knowledge. Fragments survive, blueprints survive, specialists survive. What would the next civilization look like? It would look like Uruk. Sudden competence, mature systems, a culture obsessed with preservation, anxiety about forgetting, and a deep sense that what matters most already happened. The archaeological record does not prove this scenario, but it allows it, and the texts insist on it. Because the Sumerians never say, "We invented writing." They say it was revealed. They never say, "We created law." They say it was given. They never say, "We designed the city." They say they restored it. This language is not accidental. It reflects identity. They did not see themselves as founders. They saw themselves as heirs. And heirs behave differently. They do not experiment recklessly. They do not discard tradition. They do not celebrate novelty. They maintain. They conserve. They copy. They fear loss more than stagnation. And this worldview shapes everything, from politics to cosmology. Kings are not sovereign inventors. They are caretakers of an office. Their legitimacy comes not from strength, but from alignment with ancient order. When a king rules unjustly, he is not merely cruel, he is violating precedent. He is disrupting the inheritance. This is why law codes invoke ancient authority,
why rulers justify themselves by claiming continuity, why rebellion is framed as chaos, and why order is sacred. This also explains why so many Mesopotamian figures associated with the earliest age, the Anunnaki, are remembered not as miracle workers but administrators. They allocate cities, they assign domains, they regulate water, they measure time like rulings. They are not romantic gods, they are officials. And when they withdraw, the world becomes heavier, less precise, more prone to failure. Human kings take over the office, but not the full capacity. They govern under diminished conditions, shorter lives, limited reach, partial understanding. The king list captures this transition not with theology, but with arithmetic. Reign lengths shrink. The world contracts. Humanity inherits responsibility.
When the ancient texts speak about the ones who ruled before humans, they do not speak in the language of awe. They speak in the language of order. This is the detail that quietly unsettles everything. Because if the earliest rulers were meant to be understood as gods in the later mythological sense, beings of wonder, terror, and miracle, then the texts should sound like worship. They should glow with reverence. They should erupt with the supernatural. Instead, they read like minutes from a council meeting. In the oldest Sumerian sources, the beings later called gods appear less like creators of worlds and more like managers of systems. They measure, they assign, they decide, they govern, and the name that gathers them together appears again and again across thousands of tablets, the Anunnaki. In later traditions, that word becomes heavy with mythology, underworld judges, cosmic beings, abstract divinities. But in the earliest texts, those closest to the time when kingship was said to descend, the Anunnaki behave differently. They are not distant, they are present, they are involved, and their involvement is practical. They are associated with specific cities, not vague heavens. They have jurisdictions, not mysteries. They do not inspire faith, they enforce order. One text describes them determining the calendar, when to plant, when to harvest, when festivals must occur so that labor and ritual remain synchronized. Another records them settling disputes between cities over water rights. Another places them in council, deciding boundaries, assigning domains, and confirming authority. This is not how myths behave. This is how administrations behave. The tone is unmistakable. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as beings beyond comprehension. They are portrayed as beings with responsibility. And responsibility implies accountability. In one legal tablet from the city of Lagash, a dispute over irrigation canals is resolved by invoking the authority of the Anunnaki. The phrasing is revealing. The decision is binding because the Anunnaki have decreed it, not because they will punish transgression with lightning, but because their jurisdiction is recognized. It reads like a Supreme Court ruling, and the tablet treats it as such. No ceremony, no prayer, just citation. This is where modern interpretations often fail. We bring our assumptions about what gods are supposed to be, but the Sumerians did not categorize reality the way we do. Their concept of divinity, marked by the determinative sign, often translated as God, did not mean supernatural in the modern sense. It meant elevated, authoritative, powerful enough to shape reality. Kings could be marked with it, celestial bodies could be marked with it, concepts like justice could be marked with it. The Anunnaki were divine because they operated at a level above ordinary human capacity, not because they were immaterial spirits. This ambiguity matters because it allows the texts to describe beings who are not quite human, but not incomprehensible either. Beings who live close enough to Earth to govern it directly. Beings whose authority is systemic rather than miraculous. One of the clearest examples appears in early hymns to Enlil. Enlil is often described as the chief among the Anunnaki, but his power is not expressed through spectacle. It is expressed through infrastructure. He is the one who establishes the plow, who regulates the winds that dry fields after flooding, who sets the measuring rod and line. These are engineering tools, surveying tools, the symbols of planning. In another text, Enki, often translated as a god of wisdom, is described as overseeing fresh water. Not metaphorically, literally. He governs the underground waters that feed canals and wells. He regulates flow. He prevents chaos. In a land where uncontrolled water means death, whoever controls water controls life, and the texts reflect that reality. They do not praise Enki for spiritual enlightenment. They praise him for making irrigation possible. This is governance, and governance is not abstract. It requires presence. It requires oversight. It requires authority recognized by those being governed, which raises a question ancient scribes never directly ask but clearly assume. If the Anunnaki were administrators, where did they govern from?
The answer in early texts is unsettlingly terrestrial. They do not rule from unreachable realms. They rule from temples, from cities, from specific locations. Eridu is associated with Enki, Nippur with Enlil, Sippar with Utu. Each city is linked to an administrative figure whose function aligns with that city's role in the wider system. This looks less like religion and more like a network, a distributed system of authority across the landscape. And the texts imply that humans lived under this system, not as equals, but as dependents, as laborers, as caretakers, as recipients of instruction. One early Sumerian text describes a time when humans did not know bread, did not wear clothing, and ate grass like sheep. Then the Anunnaki introduce agriculture, they introduce weaving, they introduce settled life. This is not creation from nothing. This is organization. It reads like the transition from unmanaged existence to administered society. And when that society grows too loud, too noisy, the texts describe a crisis. Not a moral crisis, an operational one. Humanity multiplies, cities grow, noise increases, the system becomes unstable, and the solution proposed is not reform, it is reduction. This is where the flood enters the narrative again, not as punishment, but as reset. In the Atrahasis epic, the decision to send the flood is debated. It is not unanimous. One administrator disagrees. Enki acts outside the decision. He preserves a remnant. Why? Because even within the system there is disagreement about how to manage humanity. This is not divine wrath, it is policy conflict. And after the flood, the solution is formalized. Human lifespans are shortened, fertility is regulated, the proximity between administrators and humans is reduced, distance is introduced, the system becomes indirect. And this is the moment when kingship is said to descend again, but now to humans. The Anunnaki step back, not gone, but no longer present. Their role shifts from governance to oversight, from managers to distant authorities, and humanity inherits the system, but not the conditions that made it easy to run. This is why post-flood texts sound anxious. They constantly refer to ancient knowledge. They constantly worry about correctness. They constantly appeal to authority that is no longer present. They know they are maintaining something incomplete. And this is why the Anunnaki are remembered with such weight. Not because they were benevolent, not because they were cruel, but because they represented a time when the system worked better, when the world was measured more precisely, when order was closer. Their absence defines the human condition that follows, and this absence is everywhere in the literature, in laments about declining justice, in complaints about corruption, in nostalgia for an earlier age, in the belief that the world is moving away from perfection, not towards it. This worldview is not optimistic, it is custodial. Humanity is not advancing, humanity is preserving, and the Anunnaki become the ultimate source of legitimacy, not because they are worshipped, but because they represent original authority. This is why later kings constantly invoke them, why legal codes reference them, why temples are dedicated to them, why rituals attempt to maintain connection. It is not fear, it is dependency. And once you understand this, the most uncomfortable implication emerges. If the Anunnaki were merely symbolic, abstract personifications of natural forces, then why are they treated as administrators? Why are their decisions binding? Why are their jurisdictions defined? Why are they associated with specific cities and functions? Why do they withdraw instead of transforming? Why does kingship descend from heaven twice? Symbolism does not behave this way. Institutions do. Now, that does not mean the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings or lost superhumans. The evidence does not demand that conclusion. But it does demand that we take ancient self-understanding seriously. The Sumerians believed that authority preceded humanity. They believed governance existed before kings-humans. They believed their role was to inherit, not invent. And they organized their entire civilization around that belief. This is why later mythologization complicates the picture. As centuries pass, stories accumulate, poetry grows, divinity thickens, but the earliest layer, the administrative layer, remains visible beneath the myth, like a blueprint under a painting. You can see it if you look closely, and once you do, the Anunnaki stop looking like gods in the modern sense. They start looking like something more ambiguous, something closer to predecessors, to overseers, to architects of order whose designs humans inherited without fully understanding. Which leads to a final, deeply uncomfortable question for this section. If the Anunnaki were administrators, what exactly were they administering? A world, a system, a civilization. And if that civilization existed before the flood, then the first human civilization we know may not have been the first attempt at all. It may have been the second or the third.
The most revealing truths of the ancient world are not always written in words. Sometimes they are built, stone by stone, brick by brick, layer upon layer. Because if the Mesopotamians believed they were inheritors rather than founders, that belief had to take physical form somewhere. And it did, everywhere. In the ground beneath their cities. When archaeologists excavated the earliest sacred sites in southern Mesopotamia, they expected to find architectural evolution. Small shrines growing larger, simple layouts becoming complex, crude beginnings refining into sophistication. Instead, they found repetition. At Eridu, the city the king list names as the first seat of kingship, excavators uncovered something extraordinary. Beneath the visible ruins lay not one older temple, but many. 16 distinct construction phases, each temple built directly on top of the previous one. And here is the detail that refuses to be ignored. Every single temple followed the same plan, the same orientation, the same internal layout, the same placement of altar and shrine. Across thousands of years, through floods, dynastic collapses, and cultural shifts, the design never changed. The temples grew larger, yes, they rose higher, they became more monumental, but they did not become different. This is not architectural stagnation, this is architectural fidelity. Each generation was not asking, what should a temple look like now? They were asking, how was it before? And the answer was not negotiable. The earliest temple, the deepest one, the oldest layer, set the pattern. Every later structure was an echo, carefully aligned, deliberately replicated. This is not how cultures behave when they believe they are inventing. This is how cultures behave when they believe they are restoring something sacred. The same pattern appears at Nippur, Uruk, Ur, and Lagash. Sacred precincts rebuilt on ancient foundations. New brick laid precisely where old brick once stood. Streets following older axes even when rebuilding would have been easier elsewhere. And this insistence on continuity required extraordinary effort. Flood damage meant clearing silt, measuring buried foundations, re-establishing alignments that could no longer be seen. Why go to such lengths? Because the alignment itself mattered. Because the plan itself was authoritative. Because deviation would not be improvement, it would be corruption. This philosophy reaches its most dramatic expression in the ziggurat. The ziggurat is not a practical building. It is not defensive. It is not residential. It is not economic. It is symbolic. A stepped mountain of brick rising from the plain, tier by tier toward the sky. In Sumerian, these structures were called Temen Anki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. That name alone tells you everything. These buildings were not monuments to kings. They were anchors, points where the structure of the cosmos was believed to touch the ground. And they were built again and again, not redesigned, not reimagined, but restored. Take the great ziggurat of Ur. The visible structure dates to the reign of Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, but beneath it lie earlier platforms, older foundations, remnants of previous iterations. Ur-Nammu did not claim invention. In his foundation inscriptions, he states plainly that he rebuilt the temple as it existed in ancient days. Not improved, not expanded, as it existed. When later kings rebuilt the ziggurat, they said the same thing. Each rebuild was framed as fidelity to an original design whose origin was already ancient to them. And the precision of these structures is not accidental. The corners of the ziggurats align with the cardinal directions, their proportions follow consistent ratios, their tiered levels correspond to celestial symbolism. 7 levels, 7 visible celestial bodies, 7 divisions of cosmic order. This is not aesthetic choice, it is mapping. The ziggurat is a diagram made of brick, a translation of a cosmological model into architecture. But here is the unsettling question. How did the earliest builders know this model? The earliest temple platforms predate written astronomy. They predate detailed star catalogs. They predate theoretical mathematics as we understand it. Yet the alignments are there from the beginning. This suggests one of two possibilities. Either the earliest builders possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge that left no developmental trace, or they were copying a pattern already established. And the texts strongly favor the second. Time and again, rulers describe receiving plans, not inventing them. Gudea of Lagash, in one of the most detailed construction accounts ever discovered, describes a dream in which a divine figure presents him with a tablet showing the plan of a temple. The scene is often interpreted mystically, but read literally, it describes something more practical, a blueprint, a design preserved in a durable medium, knowledge transmitted from an earlier authority. Gudea does not improvise, he measures. He follows instructions, he replicates. And when the temple is complete, he dedicates it not as a new creation, but as a restoration of ancient order. This pattern extends beyond temples. Cities themselves follow inherited plans.
At Nippur, excavators discovered that the sacred district remained fixed for centuries. Even when cities were destroyed and rebuilt, the location of the central temple never shifted. The city reorganized itself around that point, as if the ground itself remembered where authority belonged. In some cases, later cities grew around abandoned sacred centers, treating the old location as untouchable even when it was no longer functional. Memory became geography. This is where architecture stops being construction and becomes archive. Every wall preserves information, every foundation marks continuity, every rebuild is an act of remembrance. The Mesopotamians did not preserve the past only in texts, they embedded it in space. And this spatial memory extended to surveying and measurement. The same units of length appear across centuries, the same ratios recur, the same proportional systems govern temple platforms, city walls, and canals. This consistency implies standardization, and standardization implies authority. Someone decided how long a cubit should be, how wide a canal must be, how high a platform must rise, and those decisions endured beyond individual kings. They were not renegotiated, they were inherited. Which brings us back again to the flood. Because if the flood disrupted the system, then rebuilding required more than labor. It required reference. It required knowing what correct looked like. And the Mesopotamians behaved as if that reference existed, as if the blueprint had survived. Perhaps in temple archives, perhaps in oral transmission, perhaps in specialists who remembered more than others. The details are lost, but the behavior remains visible. Restoration, not foundation. This is why kings emphasize archaeology. Nabonidus, ruling in the 6th century BCE, is famous for digging into ancient foundations. He was not searching for treasure, he was searching for authenticity. He wanted to find the original cornerstones, the old inscriptions, the ancient alignments, because legitimacy flowed backward. The older the reference, the stronger the authority. This is the opposite of modern thinking. Today, innovation confers status. In Mesopotamia, antiquity did. The past was not primitive. The past was pure. And the present was always, in some sense, decline. This worldview shapes how knowledge itself is treated. Mathematical tablets are copied without explanation. Astronomical tables are preserved long after their practical meaning fades. Medical texts list procedures that later physicians struggle to interpret, yet they are copied anyway, because they are ancient, and ancient equals authoritative. This is not blind superstition, it is cultural memory responding to loss. When you know that something essential has already been lost once, you become careful. You stop experimenting, you stop modifying, you preserve. This is why scribes include colophons saying, "Do not alter," why they warn against corruption of the text, why they attribute knowledge to ancient figures rather than contemporary ones. Because if knowledge was inherited, then altering it risks breaking the system. This belief does not require the Anunnaki to be literal beings. It requires only that ancient people believed knowledge preceded them, and that belief structured their civilization. The ziggurat in this sense is the most honest artifact Mesopotamia left behind. It does not pretend to be new. It does not celebrate originality. It rises again and again, identical in form, proclaiming continuity. A physical refusal to forget. And that refusal becomes more poignant when you realize how often Mesopotamia collapsed. Floods, droughts, invasions, internal strife. Empires rose and fell with startling speed. Yet the same plans reappear. The same laws are restored. The same measurements
Once you recognize the pattern in Mesopotamia, it becomes impossible to unsee it elsewhere. Not because the stories are identical. They are not. The names change, the landscapes change, the symbols shift with culture and geography, but the structure remains. Again and again, across civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, the same outline appears. An earlier age of rule that was not human, a catastrophic division of time, and humanity stepping into governance as inheritors, not creators. This is where coincidence begins to feel insufficient. Let us begin in Egypt. In the early 19th century, a fragmentary papyrus was discovered and later catalogued as the Turin King List. At first glance, it appears similar to the Mesopotamian lists, columns of names, reign lengths, dynasties. But when scholars examined the beginning of the document, they encountered something unexpected. Before the first human pharaoh, before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the list records rulers who were not human, gods. And before them, beings known as the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. These figures are not treated as metaphors. They are given reign lengths. They are placed within a chronological framework. They govern for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. Only after their rule does the list transition into what Egyptologists consider historical time. The format does not change. The tone does not change. The scribe makes no distinction between divine and human rulers. Both are recorded as legitimate holders of authority. This is not mythology appended to history. It is history that begins before humanity claims the throne. Egyptian temple inscriptions reinforce this view. They repeatedly describe the earliest age as a time when the gods ruled directly upon the earth. Pharaohs do not invent kingship, they inherit it. Their legitimacy comes from embodying divine order, Mat, a principle that existed before them and will exist after them. The pharaoh is not sovereign in the modern sense. He is a steward, a caretaker of an order older than humanity. And like Mesopotamia, Egypt preserves the memory of withdrawal. Texts speak of a distant golden age, followed by decline. The gods retreat to the sky, humans govern in their absence. Time becomes heavier, shorter, less perfect. Now turn east to the Indian subcontinent. The Puranic texts describe history not as a straight line, but as a series of descending ages, yugas. The earliest age, the Satya Yuga, is not paradise in a naive sense. It is described as an age of order. Dharma, cosmic law, operates perfectly. The gods are present, knowledge is complete, humanity lives under direct guidance. Then the ages decline. With each yuga, divine presence diminishes, knowledge fragments, human lifespans shorten. By the time we reach the current age, the Kali Yuga, the gods have withdrawn entirely. Humanity governs itself using incomplete memory of what once was fully known. This structure mirrors Mesopotamia with unsettling precision, an early age of direct administration, a catastrophic or transitional division, a gradual contraction of lifespan and clarity, and an inheritance passed down through diminishing conditions. The Hindu texts do not frame this as progress, they frame it as decay. The past is not primitive, it is superior. The present is not advanced, it is compromised. Now cross the ocean. In Mesoamerica, the Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Maya, describes multiple previous worlds. Each world is created, governed, and then destroyed. The current world is not the first, it is the latest. Earlier worlds were populated by beings who failed or withdrew. The gods teach humans astronomy, agriculture, and calendrical systems. Then they depart, leaving humanity to maintain what was given. Aztec tradition echoes this pattern. The annals of Cuautitlan describe 5 suns, 5 ages of the world. Each age ends in catastrophe. Each is governed differently. The current age is explicitly temporary. It is not presented as a culmination, but as survival. Quetzalcoatl, the teacher figure, arrives from across the sea or descends from the sky. He establishes order. He teaches.
And then he leaves, promising return. This is not a story of invention, it is a story of inheritance and absence. South America offers the same refrain. In Incan tradition, Viracocha emerges after a flood. He organizes the world, raises monuments, establishes law. Then he departs westward across the ocean. Human rulers inherit his system, but they do not claim to have created it. They claim descent. Now move east again, to China. The Bamboo Annals, an ancient chronicle, begins not with human emperors, but with the 3 sovereigns. These figures rule for thousands of years. They teach agriculture, they establish medicine, they define social order. Only after them does dynastic history begin. Later Confucian scholars struggled with this. Were these symbolic? Were they mythic? The texts themselves do not answer. They record reigns, they list accomplishments, they treat the sovereigns as administrators of early order, not storytellers, not metaphors, administrators. The Yellow Emperor does not invent civilization, he restores it, and his authority comes from alignment with earlier order. Now, pause. These cultures had no contact, no shared language, no shared mythology, and yet they preserve the same shape of memory. An earlier age governed by non-human or semi-divine figures, a catastrophic division or transition, humanity inheriting a diminished world, knowledge preserved through tradition, ritual, architecture, and law. This is not diffusion, it is convergence, which raises an uncomfortable possibility, that the memory being preserved predates the civilizations preserving it, not a shared story, a shared inheritance. Now consider how these cultures treat knowledge. In every case, the most advanced sciences, astronomy, mathematics, calendrical systems, are attributed to earlier figures, not to contemporary innovators. The Maya calendar appears fully formed. The Hindu astronomical cycles describe time spans far exceeding human history. Egyptian geometry appears suddenly precise. Chinese medicine emerges systematized. And none of these cultures claim invention. They claim revelation, transmission, teaching. Now recall what Mesopotamia did. They attributed writing to Nisaba, law to Utu, measurement to Enlil, water management to Enki. Knowledge belonged to the past. Humanity's role was to remember. And this is why ancient civilizations feared forgetting more than they celebrated discovery. They did not race toward the future, they guarded the past. This worldview shapes their entire historical consciousness. History is not progress, it is decline managed through preservation. Each generation stands farther from the source, closer to ignorance, which means authority must be anchored backward. The older the source, the truer the knowledge. This belief is not accidental. It emerges naturally when a culture believes it survived catastrophe. When you believe the world once operated under better conditions, you do not assume tomorrow will be better than yesterday. You assume the opposite. You conserve, you archive, you rebuild according to ancient plans. You justify power by continuity. This is why king lists matter. They are not myths, they are constitutional documents. They establish legitimacy by linking the present to an ancient chain, and that chain often begins before humanity. So, when modern readers ask, were these gods real, they may be asking the wrong question. The more revealing question is, why did ancient people everywhere remember authority as older than themselves? Why did they treat civilization as inheritance? Why did they organize society around preservation rather than innovation? And why did so many of them independently remember a time when governance was closer, clearer, and more direct? The answer may not be singular, it may not be literal, but it is consistent. Humanity remembers itself not as founder, but as successor, and that memory shaped everything. In the final section, we return to Mesopotamia, but with this global perspective in mind. Because when you place the Anunnaki alongside the Shemsu Hor, the sovereigns, the Devas, the culture heroes of the Americas, something shifts. They stop looking like isolated myths. They begin to look like different names for the same idea: a memory of governance, a memory of order, a memory of inheritance. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all: if humanity once believed it inherited a world already measured, what does it mean if we have forgotten what we were meant to preserve?
When a civilization believes it is an heir rather than a founder, its deepest anxiety is not conquest. It is loss. Loss of knowledge, loss of alignment, loss of memory. This anxiety runs like a quiet current beneath the entire history of Mesopotamia, and, as we have seen, beneath many ancient cultures across the world. By the late 6th century BCE, this anxiety had become explicit. Kings were no longer simply rulers, they were archivists. Take Nabonidus, the last native king of Babylon. Modern historians often describe him as eccentric, even obsessive. He spent years excavating ancient foundations, searching for old inscriptions, consulting priestly scholars about temples that had fallen into ruin long before his reign. But from within his own worldview, Nabonidus was not eccentric. He was responsible. In one inscription, he writes that he searched for the original foundation stones of temples so that he could rebuild them according to the ancient writing, ensuring that nothing was altered, not improved, not modernized, preserved. This is not the language of a man confident in progress. This is the language of someone afraid that the chain of inheritance is breaking. By Nabonidus' time, Mesopotamian civilization had already endured over 3,000 years of collapse and renewal. Empires had risen and fallen. Languages had changed. Scripts had evolved. Entire cities had been abandoned and reclaimed. And through it all, scribes kept copying, even when they no longer fully understood what they were copying. We know this because they tell us. Colophons, the notes scribes added at the end of tablets, often include admissions that are quietly devastating. Written according to an old tablet. Copied faithfully, though the meaning is obscure. Do not alter, even if unclear. These are not the notes of confident scholars. They are the notes of caretakers guarding something fragile. And this fragility is not abstract. We can trace it archaeologically. Libraries burn, floods bury archives, wars scatter tablets, climate shifts empty cities, knowledge contracts. What survives does so not because it is useful, but because it is revered. This explains one of the strangest features of ancient science. Advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge appears early and then stalls. The sexagesimal system, sophisticated geometric solutions, planetary cycles. They do not steadily improve, they persist. They are preserved intact for centuries, sometimes millennia, and then fade. Not because they were wrong, but because the institutional memory required to fully use them disappears. Consider Babylonian astronomy. By the first millennium BCE, astronomers could predict eclipses, track planetary retrograde motion, and calculate synodic periods with impressive accuracy. Yet the theoretical framework underlying these calculations remains opaque. The tablets record results, not derivations, procedures, not explanations. It is as if the how survived, but the why was lost. This pattern repeats in medicine. Diagnostic texts list symptoms and prognoses with clinical precision, but later commentaries admit uncertainty about underlying mechanisms. The procedures work, the reasoning behind them is inherited, not rediscovered. And then there is law. The earliest legal codes are strikingly humane. They distinguish between intent and accident. They protect the vulnerable. They regulate contracts and property with sophistication. Later codes do not improve dramatically upon them. They reiterate, they restore, they invoke older authority, because law, like architecture and astronomy, is treated as something revealed, not invented. This worldview creates a peculiar relationship with time. The past is not something to escape, it is something to approximate. The present is not progress, it is survival. And the future is uncertain precisely because it risks forgetting. This explains why Mesopotamian kings were obsessed with lists, king lists, temple inventories, genealogies, catalogs. They are not mere record-keeping, they are continuity mechanisms, ways to stitch the present to the past, ways to say, we belong to this chain. Even the Sumerian word for wisdom, namku, carries this weight. It implies something precious, hidden, inherited, not discovered through experimentation, but guarded through transmission. Now consider what happens when such a civilization finally collapses. When Babylon falls, when temples are abandoned, when scribal schools close, the chain breaks, not all at once, but slowly. Tablets crack, languages die, archives scatter. What remains are fragments, and those fragments shape the civilizations that come later. Greek scholars encounter Babylonian astronomy and marvel at its age.
Hebrew texts preserve echoes of flood narratives and ancient kingship. Islamic scholars inherit mathematical concepts whose origins are already obscured. Each culture receives remnants, each interprets them through its own framework, and the original context recedes further. This is how inheritance fades, not through destruction alone, but through reinterpretation, through translation without comprehension, through preservation without understanding. The ancient world knew this. They feared it. That fear is written everywhere, in the insistence on copying exactly, in the refusal to innovate sacred forms, in the reverence for antiquity. They understood that once the chain breaks, it cannot be repaired. And perhaps that is why the Anunnaki lingers so powerfully in the texts, not as gods demanding worship, but as symbols of a time when knowledge was whole, when governance was clear, when systems worked because their architects were present. Their withdrawal marks the beginning of uncertainty. Humanity inherits the structure, but not the manual. This is why the flood matters so much, not because it destroyed everything, but because it disrupted transmission. It severed transmission. What came after was not creation from nothing, it was reconstruction from fragments. And fragments are dangerous. They invite speculation. They invite mythologizing. They invite error. Which may explain why later traditions turn administrators into gods, engineers into deities, governance into mythology. As understanding fades, reverence fills the gap. What was once practical becomes sacred. What was once technical becomes divine. And what was once remembered becomes symbolic. But beneath the symbolism, the structure remains: inheritance, succession, loss. Now bring this forward. Consider our own civilization. We pride ourselves on innovation, on progress, on breaking with the past. But how much of what we use do we truly understand? Our technologies are layered, our systems interdependent, our knowledge distributed. We rely on inherited frameworks whose origins we rarely question. Mathematics we did not invent, physical constants we did not define, biological systems we did not design. We are heirs too. The difference is that we believe we are founders. And that belief changes behavior. It encourages experimentation, risk, rapid change, which can be powerful, but also dangerous. The ancient civilizations remind us of something we have forgotten, that preservation is a form of wisdom, that continuity matters, that knowledge can be lost faster than it is gained, and that once lost, it may never be recovered. The Mesopotamians did not know who the Anunnaki were, not fully. They inherited the name, they inherited the authority, they inherited the systems, and they did their best to maintain them. They did not claim mastery, they claimed stewardship. This may be the most important lesson their texts preserve, not that gods once ruled the earth, but that civilization itself is fragile, dependent on memory, dependent on transmission, dependent on humility before the past. If humanity once believed it inherited a world already measured, already ordered, already complete, then perhaps the greatest danger is forgetting that we are still inheritors, still custodians, still responsible for passing something forward intact. Future civilizations may one day excavate our ruins. They may find our archives fragmented, our data corrupted, our technologies inert. They may reconstruct what they can, copy what survives, mythologize what they cannot understand. And they may ask the same question we ask now. Who came before us? What did they know? Why did it end? And perhaps, like the Sumerian scribes, they will write not of invention, but of inheritance, not of beginnings, but of remembering.